A pleasure to meet all at last, and welcome back to films I should have talked about years ago. So, yeah, let's just say Speed, Cruise Control probably just wasn't the best choice in terms of watching, but now I suppose we can try something different. Why don't we go ahead and tackle TNF again? Just as I have spoken about Blue Mountain Mystery earlier in this season, I actually got the chance to watch another TNF film, a much more recent addition to the series, Big World, Big Adventures from 2018. Basically, the kickstart to the Mattel era of Thomas & Friends, a supposed reboot that actually managed to do something different that Hit Entertainment could not do on their own. Because back in 2003, Hit Entertainment would acquire the series and utilize a bunch of old productions and put them all into a 7th season, supposedly making it the last hurrah of Thomas & Friends, the true Thomas & Friends that we know and love. And between 2004 and 2017 was when Hit Entertainment started using their own production divisions in order to create episodes that were mostly questionable, but you could argue in many different ways that the Hit era of Thomas & Friends was probably one of the worst periods that the franchise had ever gone into. Hit's control of the series was a complete and total mockery and had little to nothing at all in connections to what we've seen in earlier years. With the original All-Crop Productions and Golaine Entertainment Productions series that we've known and loved between 1984 and 2002, it was more than just clear that Thomas & Friends wasn't just a live-action show with talking trains. It was basically an adaptation, a series of books that brightened millions of children all over the world. And the series itself managed to really promote the existence of such ideas by one Reverend Wilson Awdry. He never even lived to see the first ever feature film known as Thomas and the Magic Railroad, which I actually got the chance to talk about in films I'm willing to talk about again. So yeah, it seems that this year, in terms of Thomas & Friends movies, there's a few that I haven't talked about, and there's a few I have talked about. So maybe one of these days I might have to get to some of the others that I have talked about, but anyways. In 2018, Mattel created Big World, Big Adventures, the first step in the right direction that would give us a much better, more reasonable spot for Thomas & Friends to be in, despite the fact that there just hasn't been that much that improved from within. Case in point, this movie basically gave us something that Hit alone was already capable of doing. They created feature-length films, and of course the TV show itself. Seasons 13 through 19, for the most part, were pretty much just nothing really special by all means. Since 2008, they have been using animation as a ways of a baseline for Thomas & Friends stories of all sorts. Now, the animation alone is what a lot of people find very disappointing about Thomas & Friends, but how it works in this movie is a completely different story. Ignoring all of the things that made Thomas & Friends very good to begin with, the CG animation they used in Big World, Big Adventure, for one, is pretty surprising, to say the least. Normally, it would be unlikable because it adheres no realistic physics at any point. They just do whatever the crap they feel like in terms of using animation to their advantage, but here in this film, the story of Thomas wanting to travel around the world. A story of the one and only #1 blue tank engine with 6 drive wheels and a funnel, dome, and small cabin. It pretty much just boils to the one question: how does one little steam engine go all the way around the world in a short amount of time? Well, you know what though? If anything, it's probably very similar to what we've seen in Around the World in 80 Days. But here, they don't canonically give us a sort of time limit. It's just about the dream that Thomas has on his own terms that he wants to go around the world someday. Because the plot basically shows him hard at work, him singing a few musical segments and all that good stuff, but just like what we've seen with Hit, it just seems that Mattel is just simply picking up the stuff that Hit left on their own terms before absorbing into Mattel themselves in 2017. So again, you could argue any which way, but I can pretty much find some things that are actually good about Mattel's ownership of the franchise itself. Although, not all ways of owning Thomas and Friends were actually good. Yeah, 2021, you know what basically showed up. But you know what though? Big World, Big Adventures was just an adventure of all sorts. An amazing theme song that actually would allow for a separate series that would technically be like a sequel to the movie. It's like with a lot of movies nowadays, and even back in the day. There always had to be an animated series or some sort of follow-up series that would continue the story from where the movie left off. The Real Ghostbusters picked up where the first Ghostbusters movie left off. And then we had Osmosis Jones in 2001, which was followed by an animated series shortly after. And then, of course, with a good majority of other franchises we've seen, every time there's a success with the movie, they happen to have something in particular that they want to do to continue the story. Whether it be a sequel or an animated series or whatnot, doesn't really matter too much. But anyways, the movie Big World, Big Adventures, as I've said before, it's primarily about Thomas traveling around the world. But how does he do so? He simply does just this one thing. He tells Cranky to get on a ship. He wants to go on a ship. He literally wants to do this exact stunt. That alone could bring a bunch of risks. Even though Sir Topham Hatt gave him the ability to do this, to make this decision, I can't quite be sure exactly how else to put this together. But Thomas does in fact do just that. He simply goes all the way out to Africa, to Kenya. After some time though on Sodor, the others find out that he's missing and that they must go find him. Sir Topham Hatt mainly joins the search party aboard some ships that will be sailing across some parts of the world that Thomas may or may not have ended up at. After some time picking around, Sir Topham Hatt does find out he did go to Africa, particularly in Kenya. Thomas himself basically went down to Kenya for one particular reason, other than just the fact that he wanted to go around the world as some sort of dream fulfillment. He actually met up with a new friend, a race car known as Ace, who alone was actually traveling around the world to go to different rallies. First in Africa, then down to Brazil in the Amazon rainforest, and then up into the California region, and then of course to China. So when you really think about it, if Thomas really wanted to travel around the world, all I pretty much counted were 4 stops for the most part. Heading down to Kenya, then to Brazil, then to California, then to Asia, in China for the most part. Doesn't that sound a little too modest? If you're really wanting to travel around the world, why not include a few more locations? I feel like that this just might be something very similar to what we've seen with other things that have to do with going around the world. There's only so many spots that they can think of to put into the plot. But I won't necessarily go off all too hard on this thing because this movie really just has the potential that it needs. So he does go to Kenya and meets up with the tank engine known as Nia. She basically wants to help Thomas carry a bunch of heavy freight cars when he apparently wants to take care of the freight cars, while Ace basically doesn't want him to participate in the rally. But the thing is that Thomas and Nia, they didn't really get off on the right track at first, but it does seem that the two bear a bit of connection to each other. Surprising as it might sound. But after some time, they do make the decision to go down to Brazil, and surprisingly, Ace shows up alongside them. They're all in the Brazilian area now, the Amazon rainforest. Ace goes onto his track, and the other two pretty much continue on with the shipment of coffee that is meant to go all the way up to the California region. Now, that is pretty extreme if you ask me. How exactly are two tank engines supposed to take thousands of pounds of coffee all the way up to California? It's just strange. The California and Nevada region, technically a desert-like area, where Thomas and Nia do both get their shipments done. Unfortunately, in doing so, Thomas ends up going on a path, another track different than what Nia's heading down, and he crashes after going through a little roller coaster ride along with Ace. So, a damaged Ace and tank engine are now both stranded in the desert. Albeit another engine, whom we eventually find out is called Bo, does pass by and let them know that unlike Sodor, there are no cranes available. There's no breakdown train of any sorts. So of course, it's all about manpower in America, according to what Bo says. Which actually does take place after some time. And so, Thomas is back on the rails. Ace finally gets on his way down to the next rally. But Nia apparently is nowhere to be found, which is strange. So they basically go around trying to find her and the rally itself. So, arguments are made and Thomas just makes his mind up very well. And eventually, the last stop, the final continent around the world, is all the way out in Asia. So they all head down there next. And Nia, of course, just ignores Thomas while going uphill snowy slopes where an avalanche is likely to take place. An engine called Yongbao actually recognized Thomas from The Great Race, which of course was also its own feature-length film in and of itself that came out 2 years prior. And then of course, an avalanche does occur. Nia is swept off the tracks. She basically is swept down to the mountainside, hangs off a cliff, and all is said and done there. Thomas tries to rescue her. He doesn't. Yongbao comes in just in time, saves them both from falling down the cliff, and reconciliation is completely fulfilled. The two are now good friends and they both head back to Sodor. Ace, however, is pretty much just busy with his rallies. It's not necessarily known whether he does make a big win or not, but by the end of the movie, one thing is pretty much left loose: Sir Topham Hatt's whereabouts. So, that's just pretty much the end of the movie. It technically leaves off on a bit of a cliffhanger note, but as I've said, there was in fact an actual series that sort of continues the events from the movie. And so that's pretty much just where I end things here, because the movie does itself have some pretty fun elements. The introduction of some new characters, the usage of musical segments, which technically were a thing for a long time. We don't technically get those in the actual series or the movies. Back then, they mostly just appeared as specials that you would get on the VHS or DVD copies of Thomas and Friends related content. But here, they managed to make musicals a bit more prevalent in the series as well as the movies. The way that Mattel was able to kickstart their own era after Hit Entertainment's absorption into Mattel Creations, they actually did something that Hit never could. Give the series some more leniency, so it can appeal a little bit more to hardcore longtime fans like ourselves. And I myself actually found out that the movie itself was kind of enjoyable, unlike a good majority of Thomas and Friends related media that I've seen between 2010 and 2018. So whether you like it or not, Big World, Big Adventures sure is the huge redeeming factor that eventually came on and allowed the series to be a bit more loyal to us, to everybody at all, for a few more years. Up until 2021, the original series would finally come to an end after 24 seasons. Between 1984 and 2021, this is exactly how the original series panned out. It was a really long run, a really long time had passed, but they basically went ahead and stopped the series then and there. Later on in 2021 though, the worst thing ever in terms of reboots in TV or anything else, other than Ghostbusters Answer the Call, of course, if you remember that from last year. All Engines Go. Sucks. There could be no redemption here, that's for sure. As for the scoring though, for Big World Big Adventures 2018, I really did enjoy a lot of good aspects on this. It did seem to feel a bit of a repetitive nature. It certainly gave me the feels that Mattel's own division known as HIT actually managed to do so, but HIT did arguably do a few things different that we did not expect, and now I'm just basically grown up listening to all of the pieces, watching every bit of the HIT Entertainment era of Thomas and Friends, and now I am actually seeing for myself why they did what they did. Between 2004 and 2017, they basically continued the series, that's all. Mattel themselves took over in 2018, and this was pretty much the right step they had to take. All this time, it was sort of just dead space and dead time. So Big World Big Adventures, from my own experience, gets itself a lovely 8.9 out of 10.1. It might seem a bit generous, but it's a huge deal. Us hardcore Thomas fans, we're looking forward to seeing a more proper feature-length film, and possibly a good reboot to the series in general. One of these days I will eventually catch up to the rest of the series as a whole. I'm stuck in the middle of season 12, unfortunately, so 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20 will pretty much have to come along soon after, once I'm done with 12, but again, you could be sure that I will do just that. I will see the rest of the series for good, and I might actually be surprised at the series just as much as you guys might be. So if you want to see more, go down to my channel, then make sure that you like, subscribe, comment, follow me on social media, and stay on the Hollywood side.